Hello folks, this is Glenn Guy. Today's presentation is on using composition in landscape photography, and the image in question was made on Yellow Mountain, or Huangshan, Shan being the Chinese word for mountain, in eastern China. The image was made in January of 2011. And there's only one image through most of the presentation. So you'll be seeing it probably 4 or 5 times, but the reason for that is by the end of the presentation, I want you not to be concerned with the image or engrossed in the image in any way. I really want you just to be seeing it for its compositional elements as opposed to the subject matter. So at first, you'll, I hope, enjoy the image as an interesting photograph. And start to think about what's in the photograph, but by the end of the presentation I'm hoping you'll really just be seeing it for its compositional elements, the way it's been designed. And if that's the case, the information I hope to impart I think will be absorbed. So that's the plan. So composition is certainly an essential element in photography. And I would say it's particularly important in landscape, nature and still life photography. But really, any photograph you make does require competent composition. And the more you use compositional elements to your advantage, the better, the more interesting, the more compelling your photograph will be. So let's look at some of the design elements or compositional elements that are used in the design of this image. Focal point is another way really of referring to your primary subject in the photograph. So in a portrait it would be a person, or more specifically their face, or more specifically again their eyes. So in the case of the portrait you would have primary and secondary focal points. So you could argue that the eyes are the primary focal point, but alternatively in a shot, say, of a bride with bridesmaids standing in the background, the bride is usually the main focal point of the photograph, particularly if she's focused on, and the brides in the background, who possibly through a shallow depth of field are defocused, are de-emphasized, they then become secondary focal points in that image. Subject placement within the frame. And here's an interesting concept: negative space. So let's have a look. The focal point would be the primary subject. Well, it's trees, but you can see that the trees in the foreground, well, they're larger because they're closer to the camera, but they're also sharper. So the trees in the foreground are primary focal points. Placement in the frame. Well, yes, they're in the center, but if you look a little bit more carefully, they're actually placed slightly off-center. And that's done deliberately just to add a slight tension to the image. Because if it's too simple, if it's too straightforward, the viewer will tend to move on. And the longer you engage viewers in your images, particularly these days when we're inundated with images, the longer you can maintain their interest, the more successful you are, really. Negative space may be, for instance, a face, which you can, from a compositional point of view, you can describe as a circle or an oval shape, and that face would be surrounded by, say, a blank background, maybe white snow or a black wall. So it's the subject, the focal point of the photograph in relation to that space. And negative space, space with nothing in it, can actually impact on the power of the subject within the frame. How much space surrounds them, for instance. So in this case, the negative space would be the snow, and there's quite a lot of space, particularly on the left-hand side of the image. And, how does that space affect the primary focal points in the foreground? It's very highly composed, this image. You might also notice that between the two main trees, there's what appears to be a narrower tree in the background that's out of focus. So that's done really to create a sense of greater three-dimensional space, distance from the foreground trees to that tree in the background, and it does create a kind of a triangle between the two foreground trees and the one in the background. And triangles are a powerful compositional element. The classics: line, sometimes referred to as leading lines because they lead the viewer through the frame; shape and texture. Rhythm, balance, repetition. Well, the lines are clearly the trees, the relationship between those lines, and that might relate to the size of the lines. You know, some trees are thicker than others, at least the way it's recorded in this photograph. The space between the trees, and also the balance, because in many cases the spacing it kind of makes sense, you know, and there's a similar space between some of the trees in the photograph. Now you might say, well, okay, some of the trees have a bigger space between them and other trees have a narrower space. Okay, so there's a relationship there, the trees with a bigger space versus the trees with a smaller space in between them. These would be the sort of things that an artist would be thinking about if they were drawing the picture. Repetition, by the way, of course, was the fact that the lines were recorded in a repetitive manner. Here's a few helpful tips on how to go about composition. Slow down, for goodness sake. Most people tend to use their cameras on continuous shooting, you know, so they hold the button down, click, 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 click. They haven't really had much time to think about their composition. So it makes a lot of sense, wherever possible, to slow down and avoid pushing the button unless it's sports photography or, you know, a child and they're running around and you've got to capture the moment. But with inanimate objects, still life, nature, landscape, usually, you know, you can spend a moment or two just thinking about what's important before you start pushing the button. So, you know, what are the main focal points in the image and how can you use composition to enhance the value of those focal points within the photograph, the importance of those focal points. A couple other things we can think about. If your subject is tightly framed, they will often appear constrained or constricted, even imprisoned by the boundaries of the frame. The photographic frame, if you like, the viewfinder, you know, where onto which your image is composed, is a metaphor really for boundaries that exist in the real world. So the alternative to that is to have the subject floating in space, or otherwise maybe appearing small against a much larger surrounding, so a single tree in a landscape. Now, when it comes to placing the subject in relation to the space, we can have it tightly framed, or we can have it relatively small in the frame with lots of space, as I've mentioned. Now, in each case, how does that arrangement affect the mood, the feeling that the viewer would get when they see the image? Do they feel sorry for the tree? Is it a positive image? Is the tree endangered? All of these things can have an effect on the story that's told and the emotional impact of the photograph. And of course, if it works with a tree, it'll certainly work with a portrait as well. Now, when it comes to composing the image, all of this stuff, you know, is of interest, I hope, but you can get the theory and then simply not put it into practice. And one of the reasons for that is that I've noticed over the years, I've been teaching a long, long time, that very few people actually know how to hold the camera, and very few people know how to actually look through their camera. So they're not actually seeing what the lens is seeing. And that's really one of the great advantages of the DSLR camera. D for digital, SLR for single lens reflex. And a single lens reflex, one of the things it refers to is the fact that you can basically see everything that the lens sees through a series of mirrors inside the camera, bouncing light back up into the viewfinder. So you're seeing through the top of the camera what the lens is seeing. And of course the lens is positioned in a different part of the camera than what your eye is. So it's a pretty neat technology really. But you're only really going to be able to see what the lens sees if you have your eye in the optimal position. So my recommendation is rather than putting your nose right up against the screen on the back of your camera, turn your head side on so that the side of your nose is actually up against the screen. And then that'll allow you to actually get your eye into the viewfinder. And what you should be looking for is that you could position your head in such a way that you can actually see, if you like, count the 4 edges of the frame, that is the viewfinder. So make sure you can trace your eye around those 4 edges of the frame in a way that's comfortable, isn't painful. And you should find that outside of those 4 edges of the frame, there'll be blackness. So your image is actually surrounded by blackness. Very, very important. Because what that does is, it seems that your image, what you're photographing, somehow exists outside of the real world. It's in a world of its own. Now this might sound a bit airy-fairy, but if you go through the process I've just described, it will make sense. And what happens is you actually become much more interested in what's inside the frame. That becomes the world that you're actually dealing with, the reality that you're dealing with. And therefore you're thinking a lot less about what's outside the photographic frame. The advantage of this is, by paying more attention to what's inside the viewfinder, what's inside the photographic frame, is that you will make better compositions and therefore more successful photographs. Now, is all of the information on the bottom of the viewfinder, so as you're looking through the back of the camera, is it easy to see? There's a lot of information there that people aren't even aware of. So if I'm teaching, sort of basics in photography, I'll talk about shutter speed, aperture, and other such things, and people again will understand it theoretically, but just don't get that information is actually available to them by looking through the viewfinder. So you need to be able to turn your head side on, position your eye right inside the viewfinder so you can see the four edges of the frame and the blackness that surrounds the frame. And very importantly, along the bottom of your viewfinder, there'll be information supplied: shutter speed, aperture. A lot of cameras will give you the ISO that the camera is set to, and the buffer rate, which you can look that one up in your instruction book, but because it's not appropriate to today's talk. But that information is critical. And if you can see the information, then all you need to know is which button or which dial do I turn to change those particular settings. You don't have to keep moving your head and your eye away from the viewfinder to make changes. You simply know which button, which dial do you turn, and which direction to turn it to, for instance, make your shutter speed faster or slower. Open your aperture up wider or close it down. You'll make much better photographs if you're concentrating your attention on the subject matter and the information displayed in the viewfinder. Now, you may be able to see those numbers, but they may not be very clear. They may not be very sharp. So if that's the case, what you can do is, usually on the back of the camera, kind of around the edge of the viewfinder, sometimes on the left or the right side, sometimes on the top, there's a little slider that you can move, and that's a diopter adjustment to literally adjust the optics in the viewfinder to your own eyesight. So, you may have glasses that are a -1 or +2. Well, by moving that slider along, it's achieving a similar result. So the information displayed will be a lot sharper, a lot easier to read. Very, very important. Now, if you didn't know any of that stuff about the information in the viewfinder, you'll find those last few tips very, very helpful, I'm sure. So here's the shot again, and because you've looked at it a few times, hopefully the compositional elements are actually starting to emerge first rather than the subject matter, the trees, the snow. That should make sense by now. It's interesting, isn't it? If you keep looking at an image, your brain will actually interpret it in a different way. You can find me on my blog, travelphotographyguru.com, also on Facebook, Travel Photography Guru, and on Twitter. So Travel Photo Guru there on Twitter. Thanks so much for your participation and attention. Bye for now.